The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 15. Colbert. History will tell us, or rather history has told us, of the various events of the following day, of the splendid fetes given by the surintendant to his sovereign. Nothing but amusement and delight was allowed to prevail throughout the whole of the following day. There was a promenade, a banquet, a comedy to be acted, and a comedy, too, in which, to his great amazement, Porthos recognized M. Coquelin de Voliere as one of the actors in the piece called Les Facheux. Full of preoccupation, however, from the scene of the previous evening, and hardly recovered from the effects of the poison which Colbert had then administered to him, the king, during the whole of the day, so brilliant in its effects, so full of unexpected and startling novelties, in which all the wonders of the Arabian Nights' entertainments seemed to be reproduced for his especial amusement, the king, we say, showed himself cold, reserved, and taciturn. Nothing could smooth the frowns upon his face. Every one who observed him noticed that a deep feeling of resentment, of remote origin, increased by slow degrees, as the source becomes a river, thanks to the thousand threads of water that increase its body, was keenly alive in the depths of the king's heart. Towards the middle of the day only did he begin to resume a little serenity of manner, and by that time he had, in all probability, made up his mind. Aramis, who followed him step by step in his thoughts, as in his walk, concluded that the event he was expecting would not be long before it was announced. This time Colbert seemed to walk in concert with the Bishop of Vannes, and had he received for every annoyance which he inflicted on the king a word of direction from Aramis, he could not have done better. During the whole of the day the king, who, in all probability, wished to free himself from some of the thoughts which disturbed his mind, seemed to seek La Valliere's society as actively as he seemed to show his anxiety to flee that of M. Colbert or M. Fouquet. The evening came. The king had expressed a wish not to walk in the park until after cards in the evening. In the interval between supper and the promenade, cards and dice were introduced. The king won 1,000 pistoles, and, having won them, put them in his pocket, and then rose, saying, "And now, gentlemen, to the park." He found the ladies of the court were already there. The king, we have before observed, had won 1,000 pistoles, and had put them in his pocket; but M. Fouquet had somehow contrived to lose 10,000, so that among the courtiers there was still left 190,000 francs profit to divide. A circumstance which made the countenances of the courtiers and the officers of the king's household the most joyous countenances in the world. It was not the same, however, with the king's face, for, notwithstanding his success at play, to which he was by no means insensible, there still remained a slight shade of dissatisfaction. Colbert was waiting for or upon him at the corner of one of the avenues. He was most probably waiting there in consequence of a rendezvous which had been given him by the king, as Louis XIV, who had avoided him, or who had seemed to avoid him, suddenly made him a sign, and they then struck into the depths of the park together. But La Valliere, too, had observed the king's gloomy aspect and kindling glances. She had remarked this, and as nothing which lay hidden or smoldering in his heart was hidden from the gaze of her affection, she understood that this repressed wrath menaced someone. She prepared to withstand the current of his vengeance, and intercede like an angel of mercy. Overcome by sadness, nervously agitated, deeply distressed at having been so long separated from her lover, disturbed at the sight of the emotion she had divined, she accordingly presented herself to the king with an embarrassed aspect, which in his then disposition of mind the king interpreted unfavorably. Then, as they were alone, nearly alone, inasmuch as Colbert, as soon as he perceived the young girl approaching, had stopped and drawn back a dozen paces, the king advanced towards La Valliere and took her by the hand. "Mademoiselle," he said to her, "should I be guilty of an indiscretion if I were to inquire if you were indisposed?
for you seem to breathe as if you were oppressed by some secret cause of uneasiness, and your eyes are filled with tears." "Oh, sire, if I be indeed so, and if my eyes are indeed full of tears, I am sorrowful only at the sadness which seems to oppress your majesty." "My sadness? You are mistaken, mademoiselle. No, it is not sadness I experience." "What is it, then, sire?" "Humiliation." "Humiliation! Oh, sire, what a word for you to use!" "I mean, mademoiselle, that wherever I may happen to be, no one else ought to be the master. Well, then, look round you on every side, and judge whether I am not eclipsed, I, the king of France, before the monarch of these wide domains. Oh!" he continued, clenching his hands and teeth, "when I think that this king—" "Well, sire?" said Louise, terrified. "That this king is a faithless, unworthy servant, who grows proud and self sufficient upon the strength of property that belongs to me, and which he has stolen; and therefore I am about to change this impudent minister's fete into sorrow and mourning, of which the nymph of Vaux, as the poets say, shall not soon lose the remembrance." "Oh, your majesty!" "Well, mademoiselle, are you about to take M. Fouquet's part?" said Louis, impatiently. "No, sire; I will only ask whether you are well informed. Your majesty has more than once learned the value of accusations made at court." Louis XIV. Made a sign for Colbert to approach. "Speak, Monsieur Colbert," said the young prince, "for I almost believe that Mademoiselle de la Valliere has need of your assistance before she can put any faith in the king's word. Tell mademoiselle what M. Fouquet has done, and you, mademoiselle, will perhaps have the kindness to listen. It will not be long." Why did Louis XIV. Insist upon it in such a manner? A very simple reason. His heart was not at rest, his mind was not thoroughly convinced. There lay some dark, hidden, tortuous intrigue behind these 13 millions of francs, and he wished that the pure heart of La Valliere, which had revolted at the idea of theft or robbery, should approve, even were it only by a single word, the resolution he had taken, and which nevertheless he hesitated before carrying into execution. "Speak, monsieur," said La Valliere to Colbert, who had advanced. "Speak, since the king wishes me to listen to you. Tell me, what is the crime with which M. Fouquet is charged?" "Oh, not very heinous, mademoiselle," he returned; "a mere abuse of confidence." "Speak, speak, Colbert, and when you have related it, leave us, and go and inform M. d'Artagnan that I have certain orders to give him." "M. d'Artagnan, sire!" exclaimed La Valliere; "but why send for M. d'Artagnan? I entreat you to tell me." "Pardieu! in order to arrest this haughty, arrogant Titan, who, true to his menace, threatens to scale my heaven." "Arrest M. Fouquet, do you say?" "Ah! does that surprise you?" "In his own house!" "Why not? If he be guilty, he is as guilty in his own house as anywhere else." "M. Fouquet, who at this moment is ruining himself for his sovereign." "In plain truth, mademoiselle, it seems as if you were defending this traitor." Colbert began to chuckle silently. The king turned round at the sound of this suppressed mirth. "Sire," said La Valliere, "it is not M. Fouquet I am defending, it is yourself." "Me! You are defending me!" "Sire, you would dishonor yourself if you were to give such an order." "Dishonor myself!" murmured the king, turning pale with anger. "In plain truth, mademoiselle, you show a strange persistence in what you say." "If I do, sire, my only motive is that of serving your majesty," replied the noble hearted girl. "For that I would risk, I would sacrifice my very life without the least reserve."
Colbert seemed inclined to grumble and complain. La Valliere, that timid, gentle lamb, turned round upon him, and with a glance like lightning imposed silence upon him. "Monsieur," she said, "when the king acts well, whether, in doing so, he does either myself or those who belong to me an injury, I have nothing to say; but were the king to confer a benefit either upon me or mine, and if he acted badly, I should tell him so." "But it appears to me, mademoiselle," Colbert ventured to say, "that I too love the king." "Yes, monseigneur, we both love him, but each in a different manner," replied La Valliere, with such an accent that the heart of the young king was powerfully affected by it. "I love him so deeply that the whole world is aware of it, so purely that the king himself does not doubt my affection. He is my king and my master; I am the least of all his servants. But whoso touches his honor assails my life. Therefore, I repeat, that they dishonor the king who advise him to arrest M. Fouquet under his own roof." Colbert hung down his head, for he felt that the king had abandoned him. However, as he bent his head, he murmured, "Mademoiselle, I have only one word to say." "Do not say it, then, monsieur, for I would not listen to it. Besides, what could you have to tell me? That M. Fouquet has been guilty of certain crimes? I believe he has, because the king has said so; and from the moment the king said, 'I think so,' I have no occasion for other lips to say, 'I affirm it.' But were M. Fouquet the vilest of men, I should say aloud, 'M. Fouquet's person is sacred to the king, because he is the guest of M. Fouquet.' Were his house a den of thieves, were Vaux a cave of coiners or robbers, his home is sacred, his palace is inviolable, since his wife is living in it, and that is an asylum which even executioners would not dare to violate." La Valliere paused and was silent. In spite of himself, the king could not but admire her; he was overpowered by the passionate energy of her voice, by the nobleness of the cause she advocated. Colbert yielded, overcome by the inequality of the struggle. At last the king breathed again more freely, shook his head, and held out his hand to La Valliere. "Mademoiselle," he said, gently, "why do you decide against me? Do you know what this wretched fellow will do, if I give him time to breathe again?" "Is he not a prey which will be always within your grasp?" "Should he escape and take to flight?" exclaimed Colbert.
"Well, monsieur, it will always remain on record, to the king's eternal honor, that he allowed M. Fouquet to flee; and the more guilty he may have been, the greater will the king's honor and glory appear, compared with such unnecessary misery and shame." Louis kissed La Valliere's hand as he knelt before her. "I am lost," thought Colbert. Then suddenly his face brightened up again. "Oh, no, no! Ah, old fox, not yet," he said to himself. And while the king, protected from observation by the thick covert of an enormous lime, pressed La Valliere to his breast with all the ardor of ineffable affection, Colbert tranquilly fumbled among the papers in his pocket book, and drew out of it a paper folded in the form of a letter, somewhat yellow, perhaps, but one that must have been most precious, since the intendant smiled as he looked at it. He then bent a look full of hatred upon the charming group which the young girl and the king formed together, a group revealed but for a moment, as the light of the approaching torches shone upon it. Louis noticed the light reflected upon La Valliere's white dress. "Leave me, Louise," he said, "for some one is coming." "Mademoiselle, mademoiselle, some one is coming," cried Colbert to expedite the young girl's departure. Louise disappeared rapidly among the trees, and then, as the king, who had been on his knees before the young girl, was rising from his humble posture, Colbert exclaimed, "Ah! Mademoiselle de la Valliere has let something fall." "What is it?" inquired the king. "A paper, a letter, something white. Look there, sire." The king stooped down immediately and picked up the letter, crumpling it in his hand as he did so, and at the same moment the torches arrived, inundating the blackness of the scene with a flood of light as bright as day. Chapter XVI. Jealousy. The torches we have just referred to, the eager attention everyone displayed, and the new ovation paid to the king by Fouquet, arrived in time to suspend the effect of a resolution which La Valliere had already considerably shaken in Louis XIV.'s heart. He looked at Fouquet with a feeling almost of gratitude for having given La Valliere an opportunity of showing herself so generously disposed, so powerful in the influence she exercised over his heart. The moment of the last and greatest display had arrived. Hardly had Fouquet conducted the king towards the chateau, when a mass of fire burst from the dome of Vaux with a prodigious uproar, pouring a flood of dazzling cataracts of rays on every side, and illuming the remotest corners of the gardens. The fireworks began. Colbert, at 20 paces from the king, who was surrounded and feted by the owner of Vaux, seemed, by the obstinate persistence of his gloomy thoughts, to do his utmost to recall Louis's attention, which the magnificence of the spectacle was already, in his opinion, too easily diverting. Suddenly, just as Louis was on the point of holding it out to Fouquet, he perceived in his hand the paper which, as he believed, La Valliere had dropped at his feet as she hurried away. The still stronger magnet of love drew the young prince's attention towards the souvenir of his idol, and by the brilliant light, which increased momentarily in beauty, and drew from the neighboring villages loud cheers of admiration, the king read the letter, which he supposed was a loving and tender epistle La Valliere had destined for him. But as he read it, a death-like pallor stole over his face, and an expression of deep-seated wrath, illumined by the many-colored fire which gleamed so brightly, soaringly around the scene, produced a terrible spectacle, which every one would have shuddered at could they only have read into his heart, now torn by the most stormy and most bitter passions. There was no truce for him now, influenced as he was by jealousy and mad passion. From the very moment when the dark truth was revealed to him, every gentler feeling seemed to disappear. Pity, kindness of consideration, the religion of hospitality, all were forgotten. In the bitter pang which wrung at his heart, he, still too weak to hide his sufferings, was almost on the point of uttering a cry of alarm, and calling his guards to gather round him. This letter which Colbert had thrown down at the king's feet, doubtlessly guessed, was the same that had disappeared with the porter Toby at Fontainebleau, after the attempt which Fouquet had made upon La Valliere's heart. Fouquet saw the king's pallor, and was far from guessing the evil. Colbert saw the king's anger, and rejoiced inwardly at the approach of the storm. Fouquet's voice drew the young prince from his wrathful reverie. "What is the matter, sire?" inquired the superintendent with an expression of graceful interest. Louis made a violent effort over himself, as he replied, "Nothing." "I am afraid your majesty is suffering?" "I am suffering, and have already told you so, monsieur, but it is nothing." And the king, without waiting for the termination of the fireworks, turned towards the chateau. Fouquet accompanied him, and the whole court followed, leaving the remains of the fireworks consuming for their own amusement. The superintendent endeavored again to question Louis XIV., but did not succeed in obtaining a reply. He imagined there had been some misunderstanding between Louis and La Valliere in the park, which had resulted in a slight quarrel, and that the king, who was not ordinarily sulky by disposition, but completely absorbed by his passion for La Valliere, had taken a dislike to every one because his mistress had shown herself offended with him. This idea was sufficient to console him. He had even a friendly and kindly smile for the young king when the latter wished him good night. This, however, was not all the king had to submit to.
he was obliged to undergo the usual ceremony, which on that evening was marked by close adherence to the strictest etiquette. The next day was the one fixed for the departure. It was but proper that the guests should thank their host, and show him a little attention in return for the expenditure of his 12 millions. The only remark, approaching to amiability, which the king could find to say to M. Fouquet, as he took leave of him, were in these words: "Monsieur Fouquet, you shall hear from me. Be good enough to desire M. d'Artagnan to come here." But the blood of Louis XIV., who had so profoundly dissimulated his feelings, boiled in his veins, and he was perfectly willing to order M. Fouquet to be put an end to with the same readiness, indeed, as his predecessor had caused the assassination of le Marechal d'Ancre, and so he disguised the terrible resolution he had formed beneath one of those royal smiles which, like lightning flashes, indicated coups d'etat. Fouquet took the king's hand and kissed it. Louis shuddered throughout his whole frame, but allowed M. Fouquet to touch his hand with his lips. 5 minutes afterwards, D'Artagnan, to whom the royal order had been communicated, entered Louis XIV.'s apartment. Aramis and Philippe were in theirs, still eagerly attentive, and still listening with all their ears. The king did not even give the captain of the musketeers time to approach his armchair, but ran forward to meet him. "Take care," he exclaimed, "that no one enters here." "Very good, sire," replied the captain, whose glance had for a long time past analyzed the stormy indications on the royal countenance. He gave the necessary order at the door, but, returning to the king, he said, "Is there something fresh the matter, your majesty?" "How many men have you here?" inquired the king, without making any other reply to the question addressed to him. "What for, sire?" "How many men have you, I say?" repeated the king, stamping upon the ground with his foot. "I have the musketeers." "Well, and what others?" 20 guards and 13 Swiss." "How many men will be required to do what, sire?" replied the musketeer, opening his large, calm eyes. "To arrest M. Fouquet." D'Artagnan fell back a step. "To arrest M. Fouquet!" he burst forth. "Are you going to tell me that it is impossible?" exclaimed the king, in tones of cold, vindictive passion. "I never say that anything is impossible," replied D'Artagnan, wounded to the quick. "Very well, do it, then." D'Artagnan turned on his heel, and made his way towards the door. It was but a short distance, and he cleared it in half a dozen paces. When he reached it, he suddenly paused, and said, "Your majesty will forgive me, but, in order to effect this arrest, I should like written directions." "For what purpose? And since when has the king's word been insufficient for you?" "Because the word of a king, when it springs from a feeling of anger, may possibly change when the feeling changes." "A truce to set phrases, monsieur; you have another thought besides that?" "Oh, I, at least, have certain thoughts and ideas, which, unfortunately, others have not," D'Artagnan replied, impertinently. The king, in the tempest of his wrath, hesitated, and drew back in the face of D'Artagnan's frank courage, just as a horse crouches on his haunches under the strong hand of a bold and experienced rider. "What is your thought?" he exclaimed. "This, sire," replied D'Artagnan. "You cause a man to be arrested when you are still under his roof, and passion is alone the cause of that. When your anger shall have passed, you will regret what you have done, and then I wish to be in a position to show you your signature. If that, however, should fail to be a reparation, it will at least show us that the king was wrong to lose his temper." "Wrong to lose his temper!" cried the king, in a loud, passionate voice. "Did not my father, my grandfathers too, before me, lose their temper at times, in Heaven's name?" "The king your father and the king your grandfather never lost their temper except when under the protection of their own palace." "The king is master wherever he may be."
That is a flattering, complimentary phrase which cannot proceed from any one but M. Colbert, but it happens not to be the truth. The king is at home in every man's house when he has driven its owner out of it." The king bit his lips, but said nothing. "Can it be possible?" said D'Artagnan. "Here is a man who is positively ruining himself in order to please you, and you wish to have him arrested. Mordioux! Sire, if my name was Fouquet, and people treated me in that manner, I would swallow at a single gulp all sorts of fireworks and other things, and I would set fire to them, and send myself and everybody else in blown up atoms to the sky. But it is all the same, it is your wish, and it shall be done." "Go," said the king. "Have you men enough?" "Do you suppose I am going to take a whole host to help me? Arrest M. Fouquet? Why, that is so easy that a very child might do it. It is like drinking a glass of wormwood; one makes an ugly face, and that is all." "If he defends himself?" "He? It is not at all likely. Defend himself when such extreme harshness as you are going to practice makes the man a very martyr. Nay, I am sure that if he has 1,000,000 of francs left, which I very much doubt, he would be willing enough to give it in order to have such a termination as this. But what does that matter? It shall be done at once." "Stay," said the king. "Do not make his arrest a public affair." "That will be more difficult." "Why so?" "Because nothing is easier than to go up to M. Fouquet in the midst of 1,000 enthusiastic guests who surround him, and say, 'In the king's name I arrest you.' But to go up to him, to turn him first one way and then another, to drive him up into one of the corners of the chessboard, in such a way that he cannot escape, to take him away from his guests, and keep him a prisoner for you, without one of them, alas, having heard anything about it, that, indeed, is a genuine difficulty, the greatest of all, in truth, and I hardly see how it is to be done." "You had better say it is impossible, and you will have finished much sooner. Heaven help me, but I seem to be surrounded by people who prevent me doing what I wish." "I do not prevent your doing anything. Have you indeed decided?" "Take care of M. Fouquet, until I shall have made up my mind by to morrow morning." "That shall be done, sire." "And return when I rise in the morning for further orders. And now leave me to myself." "You do not even want M. Colbert, then?" said the musketeer, firing his last shot as he was leaving the room. The king started. With his whole mind fixed on the thought of revenge, he had forgotten the cause and substance of the offense. "No, no one," he said, "no one here. Leave me." D'Artagnan quitted the room. The king closed the door with his own hands, and began to walk up and down his apartment at a furious pace, like a wounded bull in an arena, trailing from his horn the colored streamers and the iron darts. At last he began to take comfort in the expression of his violent feelings. "Miserable wretch that he is! Not only does he squander my finances, but with his ill-gotten plunder he corrupts secretaries, friends, generals, artists, and all, and tries to rob me of the one to whom I am most attached. This is the reason that perfidious girl so boldly took his part. Gratitude! And who can tell whether it was not a stronger feeling, love itself?" He gave himself up for a moment to the bitterest reflections. "A satyr!" he thought, with that abhorrent hate with which young men regard those more advanced in life, who still think of love. "A man who has never found opposition or resistance in any one, who lavishes his gold and jewels in every direction, and who retains his staff of painters in order to take the portraits of his mistresses in the costume of goddesses." The king trembled with passion as he continued. "He pollutes and profanes everything that belongs to me. He destroys everything that is mine. He will be my death at last, I know. That man is too much for me. He is my mortal enemy, but he shall forthwith fall. I hate him. I hate him. I hate him!" And as he pronounced these words, he struck the arm of the chair in which he was sitting violently, over and over again, and then rose like one in an epileptic fit. "To morrow, to morrow, oh happy day!" he murmured. "When the sun rises, no other rival shall that brilliant king of space possess but me. That man shall fall so low, that when people look at the abject ruin my anger shall have wrought, they will be forced to confess at last and at least that I am indeed greater than he." The king, who was incapable of mastering his emotions any longer, knocked over with a blow of his fist a small table placed close to his bedside, and in the very bitterness of anger, almost weeping, and half suffocated, he threw himself on his bed, dressed as he was, and bit the sheets in his extremity of passion, trying to find repose of body at least there. The bed creaked beneath his weight, and with the exception of a few broken sounds emerging, or, one might say, exploding from his overburdened chest, absolute silence soon reigned in the chamber of Morpheus. Chapter 17. High Treason. The ungovernable fury which took possession of the king at the sight and the perusal of Fouquet's letter to Valliere, by degrees subsided into a feeling of pain and extreme weariness. Youth, invigorated by health and lightness of spirits, requiring soon that what it loses should be immediately restored, youth knows not those endless, sleepless nights which enable us to realize the fable of the vulture unceasingly feeding on Prometheus. In cases where the man of middle life, in his acquired strength of will and purpose, and the old, in their state of natural exhaustion, find incessant augmentation of their bitter sorrow, a young man, surprised by the sudden appearance of misfortune, weakens himself in sighs and groans and tears, directly struggling with his grief, and is thereby far sooner overthrown by the inflexible enemy with whom he is engaged. Once overthrown, his struggles cease. Louis could not hold out more than a few minutes, at the end of which he had ceased to clench his hands, and scorch in fancy with his looks the invisible objects of his hatred. He soon ceased to attack with his violent imprecations, not M. Fouquet alone, but even La Valliere herself. From fury he subsided into despair, and from despair to prostration. After he had thrown himself for a few minutes to and fro convulsively on his bed, his nerveless arms fell quietly down, his head lay languidly on his pillow, his limbs, exhausted with excessive emotion, still trembled occasionally, agitated by muscular contractions, while from his breast faint and infrequent sighs still issued. Morpheus, the tutelary deity of the apartment, towards whom Louis raised his eyes, wearied by his anger and reconciled by his tears, showered down upon him the sleep-inducing poppies with which his hands are ever filled. So presently the monarch closed his eyes and fell asleep. Then it seemed to him, as it often happens in that first sleep, so light and gentle, which raises the body above the couch, and the soul above the earth, it seemed to him, we say, as if the god Morpheus, painted on the ceiling, looked at him with eyes resembling human eyes, that something shone brightly, and moved to and fro in the dome above the sleeper, that the crowd of terrible dreams which thronged together in his brain, and which were interrupted for a moment, half revealed a human face, with a hand resting against the mouth, and in an attitude of deep and absorbed meditation. And strange enough, too, this man bore so wonderful a resemblance to the king himself, that Louis fancied he was looking at his own face reflected in a mirror, with the exception, however, that the face was saddened by a feeling of the profoundest pity. Then it seemed to him as if the dome gradually retired, escaping from his gaze, and that the figures and attributes painted by Lebrun became darker and darker as the distance became more and more remote. A gentle, easy movement, as regular as that by which a vessel plunges beneath the waves, had succeeded to the immovableness of the bed. Doubtless the king was dreaming,
and in this dream the crown of gold, which fastened the curtains together, seemed to recede from his vision, just as the dome, to which it remained suspended, had done, so that the winged genius which, with both its hands, supported the crown, seemed, though vainly so, to call upon the king, who was fast disappearing from it. The bed still sunk. Louis, with his eyes open, could not resist the deception of this cruel hallucination. At last, as the light of the royal chamber faded away into darkness and gloom, something cold, gloomy, and inexplicable in its nature seemed to infect the air. No paintings, nor gold, nor velvet hangings were visible any longer, nothing but walls of a dull gray color, which the increasing gloom made darker every moment. And yet the bed still continued to descend, and after a minute, which seemed in its duration almost an age to the king, it reached a stratum of air black and chill as death, and then it stopped. The king could no longer see the light in his room except as from the bottom of a well we can see the light of day. I am under the influence of some atrocious dream, he thought. It is time to awaken from it. Come, let me wake. Every one has experienced the sensation the above remark conveys. There was hardly a person who, in the midst of a nightmare whose influence is suffocating, has not said to himself, by the help of that light which still burns in the brain when every human light is extinguished, "It is nothing but a dream, after all." This was precisely what Louis XIV. Said to himself; but when he said, "Come, come, wake up," he perceived that not only was he already awake, but still more, that he had his eyes open also. And then he looked all round him. On his right hand and on his left two armed men stood in stolid silence, each wrapped in a huge cloak, and the face covered with a mask. One of them held a small lamp in his hand, whose glimmering light revealed the saddest picture a king could look upon. Louis could not help saying to himself that his dream still lasted, and that all he had to do to cause it to disappear was to move his arms or to say something aloud. He darted from his bed, and found himself upon the damp, moist ground. Then, addressing himself to the man who held the lamp in his hand, he said, "What is this, monsieur, and what is the meaning of this jest?" "It is no jest," replied in a deep voice the masked figure that held the lantern. "Do you belong to M. Fouquet?" inquired the king, greatly astonished at his situation. "It matters very little to whom we belong," said the phantom. "We are your masters now; that is sufficient." The king, more impatient than intimidated, turned to the other masked figure. "If this is a comedy," he said, "you will tell M. Fouquet that I find it unseemly and improper, and that I command it should cease." The second masked person to whom the king had addressed himself was a man of huge stature and vast circumference. He held himself erect and motionless as any block of marble. "Well," added the king, stamping his foot, "you do not answer." "We do not answer you, my good monsieur," said the giant, in a stentorian voice, "because there is nothing to say." "At least tell me what you want," exclaimed Louis, folding his arms with a passionate gesture. "You will know by and by," replied the man who held the lamp. "In the meantime, tell me where I am." "Look." Louis looked all round him, but by the light of the lamp which the masked figure raised for the purpose, he could perceive nothing but the damp walls which glistened here and there with the slimy traces of the snail. "Oh, oh, a dungeon!" cried the king. "No, a subterranean passage." "Which leads?" "Would you be good enough to follow us?" "I shall not stir from hence!" cried the king. "If you are obstinate, my dear young friend," replied the taller of the two, "I will lift you up in my arms, and roll you up in your own cloak, and if you should happen to be stifled, Why, so much the worse for you." As he said this, he disengaged from beneath his cloak a hand of which Milo of Crotona would have envied him the possession, on the day when he had that unhappy idea of rending his last oak. The king dreaded violence, for he could well believe that the two men into whose power he had fallen had not gone so far with any idea of drawing back, and that they would consequently be ready to proceed to extremities, if necessary. He shook his head and said, "It seems I have fallen into the hands of a couple of assassins. Move on, then." Neither of the men answered a word to this remark. The one who carried the lantern walked first, the king followed him, while the second masked figure closed the procession. In this manner they passed along a winding gallery of some length, with as many staircases leading out of it as are to be found in the mysterious and gloomy palaces of Anne Radcliffe's creation. All these windings and turnings, during which the king heard the sound of running water over his head, ended at last in a long corridor, closed by an iron door. The figure with the lamp opened the door with one of the keys he wore suspended at his girdle, where, during the whole of the brief journey, the king had heard them rattle. As soon as the door was opened and admitted the air, Louis recognized the balmy odors that trees exhale in hot summer nights. He paused, hesitatingly, for a moment or two, but the huge sentinel who followed him thrust him out of the subterranean passage. "Another blow," said the king, turning towards the one who had just had the audacity to touch his sovereign. "What do you intend to do with the king of France?" "Try to forget that word," replied the man with the lamp, in a tone which as little admitted of a reply as one of the famous decrees of Minos. "You deserve to be broken on the wheel for the words that you have just made use of," said the giant, as he extinguished the lamp his companion handed to him. "But the king is too kind hearted." Louis, at that threat, made so sudden a movement that it seemed as if he meditated flight, but the giant's hand was in a moment placed on his shoulder, and fixed him motionless where he stood. "But tell me, at least, where we are going," said the king. "Come," replied the former of the two men, with a kind of respect in his manner, and leading his prisoner towards a carriage which seemed to be in waiting. The carriage was completely concealed amid the trees. Two horses, with their feet fettered, were fastened by a halter to the lower branches of a large oak. "Get in," said the same man, opening the carriage door and letting down the step. The king obeyed, seated himself at the back of the carriage, the padded door of which was shut and locked immediately upon him and his guide. As for the giant, he cut the fastenings by which the horses were bound, harnessed them himself, and mounted on the box of the carriage, which was unoccupied. The carriage set off immediately at a quick trot, turned into the road to Paris, and in the forest of Senart found a relay of horses fastened to the trees in the same manner the first horses had been, and without a postilion. The man on the box changed the horses, and continued to follow the road towards Paris with the same rapidity, so that they entered the city about 3 o'clock in the morning. The carriage proceeded along the Faubourg Saint Antoine, and after having called out to the sentinel, "By the king's order," the driver conducted the horses into the circular enclosure of the Bastile, looking out upon the courtyard, called La Cour du Gouvernement. There the horses drew up, reeking with sweat, at the flight of steps, and a sergeant of the guard ran forward. "Go and wake the governor," said the coachman in a voice of thunder. With the exception of this voice, which might have been heard at the entrance of the Faubourg Saint Antoine, everything remained as calm in the carriage as in the prison. 10 minutes afterwards, M. de Baisemeaux appeared in his dressing gown on the threshold of the door. "What is the matter now?" he asked, "and whom have you brought me there?" The man with the lantern opened the carriage door, and said 2 or 3 words to the one who acted as driver, who immediately got down from his seat, took up a short musket which he kept under his feet, and placed its muzzle on his prisoner's chest. "And fire at once if he speaks," added aloud the man who alighted from the carriage. "Very good," replied his companion, without another remark. With this recommendation, the person who had accompanied the king in the carriage ascended the flight of steps, at the top of which the governor was awaiting him. "Monsieur d'Herblay," said the latter. "Hush!" said Aramis. "Let us go into your room." "Good heavens, what brings you here at this hour?" "A mistake, my dear Monsieur de Baisemeaux," Aramis replied quietly. "It appears that you were quite right the other day." "What about?" inquired the governor. "About the order of release, my dear friend." "Tell me what you mean, monsieur no, monseigneur," said the governor, almost suffocated by surprise and terror. "It is a very simple affair. You remember, dear Monsieur de Baisemeaux, that an order of release was sent to you." "Yes, for Marchiali." "Very good. We both thought that it was for Marchiali?" "Certainly. You will recollect, however, that I would not credit it, but that you compelled me to believe it." "Oh! Baisemeaux, my good fellow, what a word to make use of! Strongly recommended, that was all." "Strongly recommended, yes, strongly recommended to give him up to you, and that you carried him off with you in your carriage." "Well, my dear Monsieur de Baisemeaux, it was a mistake; it was discovered at the ministry, so that I now bring you an order from the king to set at liberty Seldon, that poor Seldon fellow, you know."
"Seldon? Are you sure this time?"
"Well, read it yourself," added Aramis, handing him the order.
"Why," said Baisemeaux, "this order is the very same that has already passed through my hands."
"Indeed?"
"It is the very one I assured you I saw the other evening. Parbleu! I recognize it by the blot of ink."
"I do not know whether it is that, but all I know is, that I bring it for you."
"But then, what about the other?"
"What other?"
"Marchiali."
"I have got him here with me."
"But that is not enough for me. I require a new order to take him back again."
"Don't talk such nonsense, my dear Baisemeaux; you talk like a child. Where is the order you received respecting Marchiali?" Baisemeaux ran to his iron chest and took it out. Aramis seized hold of it, coolly tore it in 4 pieces, held them to the lamp, and burnt them.
"Good heavens, what are you doing?"
exclaimed Baisemeaux, in an extremity of terror. "Look at your position quietly, my good governor," said Aramis, with imperturbable self possession, "and you will see how very simple the whole affair is. You no longer possess any order justifying Marchiali's release."
"I am a lost man."
"Far from it, my good fellow, since I have brought Marchiali back to you, and all accordingly is just the same as if he had never left." "Ah!" said the governor, completely overcome by terror. "Plain enough, you see, and you will go and shut him up immediately."
"I should think so, indeed."
"And you will hand over this Seldon to me, whose liberation is authorized by this order. Do you understand?"
I
"You do understand, I see," said Aramis. "Very good." Baisemeaux clapped his hands together.
"But why, at all events, after having taken Marchiali away from me, do you bring him back again?"
cried the unhappy governor, in a paroxysm of terror, and completely dumbfounded. "For a friend such as you are," said Aramis, "for so devoted a servant, I have no secrets." And he put his mouth close to Baisemeaux's ear, as he said, in a low tone of voice, "You know the resemblance between that unfortunate fellow and
"And the king, yes."
Very good. The first use that Marchiali made of his liberty was to persist. Can you guess what?"
"How it is likely I should guess."
"To persist in saying that he was king of France, to dress himself up in clothes like those of the king, and then pretend to assume that he was the king himself."
"Gracious heavens!"
That is the reason why I have brought him back again, my dear friend. He is mad, and lets every one see how mad he is." "What is to be done, then?" "That is very simple. Let no one hold any communication with him. You understand that when his peculiar style of madness came to the king's ears, the king, who had pitied his terrible affliction, and saw that all his kindness had been repaid by black ingratitude, became perfectly furious, so that now, and remember this very distinctly, dear Monsieur de Baisemeaux, for it concerns you most closely, so that there is now, I repeat, sentence of death pronounced against all those who may allow him to communicate with any one else but me or the king himself. You understand, Baisemeaux, sentence of death." "You need not ask me whether I understand." "And now let us go down and conduct this poor devil back to his dungeon again, unless you prefer he should come up here." "What would be the good of that?" "It would be better, perhaps, to enter his name in the prison book at once." "Of course, certainly, not a doubt of it." "In that case, have him up." Baisemeaux ordered the drums to be beaten and the bell to be rung, as a warning to every one to retire, in order to avoid meeting a prisoner, about whom it was desired to observe a certain mystery. Then, when the passages were free, he went to take the prisoner from the carriage, at whose breast Porthos, faithful to the directions which had been given him, still kept his musket leveled. "Ah! is that you, miserable wretch?"
cried the governor, as soon as he perceived the king.
"Very good, very good."
And immediately, making the king get out of the carriage, he led him, still accompanied by Porthos, who had not taken off his mask, and Aramis, who again resumed his, up the stairs, to the second Battaglia, and opened the door of the room in which Philippe for 6 long years had bemoaned his existence. The king entered the cell without pronouncing a single word. He faltered in as limp and haggard as a rain-struck lily. Baisemeaux shut the door upon him, turned the key twice in the lock, and then returned to Aramis.
"It is quite true," he said, in a low tone, "that he bears a striking resemblance to the king, but less so than you said."
"So that," said Aramis, "you would not have been deceived by the substitution of the one for the other?"
"What a question!"
"You are a most valuable fellow, Baisemeaux," said Aramis; "and now set Seldon free."
"Oh, yes, I was going to forget that. I will go and give orders at once."
"Bah! to morrow will be time enough."
"To morrow! Oh, no, this very minute."
"Well, go off to your affairs, I will go away to mine; but it is quite understood, is it not?"
"What is quite understood?"
"That no one is to enter the prisoner's cell, except with an order from the king, an order which I will myself bring."
"Quite so. Adieu, monseigneur."
Aramis returned to his companion. "Now, Porthos, my good fellow, back again to Vaux, and as fast as possible." "A man is light and easy enough when he faithfully served his king, and in serving him saved his country," said Porthos. "The horses will be light as if our tissues were constructed of the wind of heaven. So let us be off." And the carriage, lightened of a prisoner, who might well be, as he in fact was, very heavy in the sight of Aramis, passed across the drawbridge of the Bastile, which was raised again immediately behind it.